As a military officer, I was trained to face the enemy, but I never imagined that the greatest battle of my life would be fought at my own family's dinner table. You never think the traitors will be your own flesh and blood, the person you share your bed with. But I saw it with my own eyes, my sister holding my husband's hand, announcing she was pregnant with his child. My parents didn't object. On the contrary, they seemed pleased, as if this was their way of keeping the wealthy son-in-law in the family. They turned something sordid into a business transaction over dinner, right in front of me. And I just sat there, silent, observing, memorizing each face that was complicit in this farce. The only question left was, how long did they think I would swallow this humiliation? I am Anya Petrova, 33 years old, a captain and logistics officer in the United States Army. People often say, I'm disciplined, strong, responsible, and they're right. But what no one sees is the emptiness that hits when I step off base and return to a family where my existence has never been valued. At home, I'm not Captain Petrova. I'm just Anya, Chloe's older sister. Anything I had, Chloe wanted a better, shinier version of. My parents always treated Chloe like a precious treasure. When I earned a scholarship to West Point, my parents threw a small party. When Chloe got into an expensive private university on their dime, they threw a bigger one. Their favoritism wasn't even subtle. It was as clear as the rank on my uniform. Chloe was the delicate piece of art that needed protecting, while I was the reliable tool, meant to be used and expected to maintain itself. Chloe was raised coddled, bearing no responsibility, only demanding and receiving. I was different. The harder I tried, the more I achieved, the more I was compared, as if my discipline and success held no value next to my sister's pouting smile. To Chloe, I wasn't a sister, I was the shadow she had to overcome. And then came David. David Chen, my husband, a successful tech entrepreneur who my parents always called the family's true pride. He was everything they ever wanted, wealthy, respected, and not in the military. I knew they saw him as a trophy, a compensation for their rigid, career-focused older daughter. David was a good man, but his ego was built on an image of perfect success. Any crack in that facade could shatter him. The biggest burden, the only crack in our seemingly perfect marriage, was a silence that stretched for years. We couldn't have children. At family gatherings, it was a ghost that haunted the room. It was there in my mother's pitying glances, in my aunt's casual questions, in the way my father would clap David on the shoulder with sympathy. Everyone implicitly understood that the problem was me, my soldier's body, too hardened by life. And I never denied it. I quietly accepted the whispers, shouldering their looks like another piece of my gear. It was a heavy burden, but I thought I was strong enough to carry it. I returned to Austin after a long deployment. My suitcase was still covered in dust I hadn't even unpacked when my mother called, her voice full of excitement. We're having a cozy family dinner, you have to come. I believed her. After years in the service, sometimes all I wanted was a normal family meal. The atmosphere in my parents' dining room that night was strange. It was the quiet before a storm. Chloe was glowing, an unnaturally wide smile plastered on her face. David avoided my gaze, constantly refilling his wine glass even when it was full. My parents feigned cheerfulness, asking me hollow questions about my work that they never truly cared about. I just watched in silence, taking in every detail. Every forced smile, every averted glance was a signal. I knew something was coming. And then it came. In the middle of the meal, David set down his silverware. He cleared his throat, and Chloe immediately placed her hand on his. Everyone, David began, we have some happy news to share. Chloe, with a triumphant smile, placed her other hand on her stomach. I'm pregnant. A heavy silence fell. I looked at them, then at my parents. I waited for outrage, confusion, or at least a flicker of shock. I got nothing. My mother was the one who broke the silence. She looked at me, not with anger on her daughter's behalf, but with a look of feigned sympathy. Anya, dear, this is an awkward situation, she said, her voice soft. But at least the baby will be in the family. This is the best way to keep David in the family. That's right, my father added, his voice as pragmatic as ever. You couldn't give him a child. Chloe can. It's as simple as that. The air in the room felt like it had frozen solid. I glanced at my father. He didn't flinch. He just poured more wine, as if this had all been decided long ago. It clicked. They knew. They had chosen to side with David and Chloe, using my supposed inability to have children to justify a betrayal. I didn't need to ask any more questions. I didn't need to scream. I just looked at each of them, one by one. My gaze lingered on David, then on Chloe, and finally on my parents. My silence made the room heavy with unspoken words. I stood up, my voice so calm it surprised even me. I understand. I pushed my chair in neatly, picked up my coat, and left the table. Behind me were 4 people who thought they had just made a wise decision. They had no idea that in that moment, they had turned their family dinner into my battlefield. I drove away from that house with no destination in mind. The radio was off. The Austin city lights blurred past the car window, but my mind wasn't there. It was traveling back in time to an afternoon 3 years ago in a clinic in San Antonio. I remembered sitting on a hard plastic chair in the waiting room, my hand clutching David's. He was nervous, constantly rubbing his thumb over the back of my hand. He was scared, not for me, but for himself. The ego of a successful man allows for no flaws. When the doctor called us in, he used a lot of medical terms, but there was only one conclusion. I remember the look on David's face when he heard those words, as if his entire world had collapsed. The next day, I went back to the clinic alone to pick up the final report. I stood in the hallway and opened the envelope. The words at the bottom were in bold: azoospermia, diagnosis, sterile. In that moment, I made a decision. I saw the broken man I loved, and I wanted to protect him. I went home, tucked that paper deep inside an old box, and told David the doctor had called back. I told him the problem was me. I carried that burden. I accepted the pity from his family and from mine. I endured the whispers, the sympathetic looks. I did it for love, to protect his pride. And tonight, he had used that very sacrifice, the very lie I created to protect him, as an excuse to validate his betrayal. The anger inside me was no longer a smoldering ember. It had been forged into cold steel. It didn't make me lose control. On the contrary, it brought me absolute clarity. I pulled over on the side of a quiet residential street. I took out my phone. The screen lit up, and I made my first call. "Hello," a professional voice answered. "Mark, it's Anya Petrova," I said, my voice even. Mark Reed was the best lawyer in the city, known for being a shark who never lost a case. "I need to see you, tomorrow morning, about a divorce." After hanging up, I opened my contacts and dialed another number. "Hey, Anya," a voice from an old friend in the security business answered. "Long time no see." "I need a favor, John," I said, getting straight to the point. "An investigation, off the books, on my husband David Chen and my sister Chloe Petrova." The pain didn't disappear. The betrayal was still there, a sharp, aching wound. But now, it had a purpose. It was no longer a burden. It was a weapon, and I knew exactly how to use it. From the moment I left that dinner table, I was no longer the betrayed wife. I reverted to the version of myself I knew best, an officer on a mission. This divorce wasn't a family dispute to me. It was a campaign. It had objectives. It had a strategy, and it required a decisive victory. I met Mark Reed in his office on the top floor of a glass skyscraper overlooking the city. Everything was sleek, expensive, and radiated power. Mark listened to my story without interruption, only occasionally jotting down a note. He showed no pity. He just saw a problem to be solved, a battle to be won. That's why I chose him. "The evidence of an affair is clear," Mark concluded after I'd finished. "We'll easily have the upper hand in the asset division, but to maximize our leverage, we need to prove he misused marital assets throughout the affair." "I understand," I replied. "John is on it." John was a machine. He'd worked in military intelligence before starting his own private investigation firm. He didn't ask many questions. He just delivered. The first report arrived 3 days later in an encrypted email. It was a PDF, filled with things a wife should never have to see, but everything a lawyer needs. Our joint credit card statements, paying for expensive dinners at restaurants I'd never been to. Weekend getaways to Napa I knew nothing about. Receipts for jewelry, shipped to a different address. That address, John had confirmed, was a luxury high-rise apartment downtown. The lease was in Chloe's name, but the monthly rent was on autopay from one of David's personal accounts. The second report came a week later. This time it was photos, crisp, long-lens shots. David and Chloe leaving the apartment building in the morning, hand in hand. David opening the door to Chloe's new car, a car I knew she couldn't afford. They looked like a happy couple, living a life built with my and David's money, and on my sacrifice. I forwarded everything to Mark. Every file, every photo was another bullet loaded into the magazine. I had no contact with my family. My phone rang constantly for the first few days, calls from my mother, my father, even Chloe. I didn't answer. I had no interest in hearing fake apologies or pathetic excuses. My silence, I knew, would unnerve them more than any threat. They were expecting a reaction, a confrontation, but I wasn't going to give them what they wanted. The confrontation wouldn't happen in their living room. It would happen on my terms, at a time and place of my choosing. And when it came, they would be completely unprepared. Weeks passed in silence. I focused on my work, on arranging my new life. I had requested a transfer to another base, in Colorado, a fresh start where no ghosts from the past could reach me. The paperwork was filed. My time in Austin was coming to an end, in every sense of the word. Meanwhile, Mark and John finalized the file. The finished dossier sat on Mark's conference table, thick and cold. It wasn't just proof of an affair. It was a detailed indictment of systematic deception and financial abuse. "We have everything," Mark said, tapping the folder. "More than enough to make David accept any settlement we propose, just to keep this out of a public courtroom." He paused, looking at me. "But there's the other thing you mentioned at the beginning, his medical results. Are we using that?" I had thought about it a lot. The paper confirming David's sterility, still sitting in that old box at home. It wasn't just a piece of evidence. It was the heart of the betrayal, the reason for my sacrifice. "No," I replied firmly. "Not yet. The objective of this battle, for now, is assets. Every dollar he wasted on her from our joint funds, I'm getting it back. The medical issue is a separate matter." Mark nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He got it. This wasn't an all-out assault. It was a phased campaign. "All right," he said, straightening the papers. "Here's the plan. I'll serve him with the divorce papers, along with a settlement offer. It will state that if he doesn't accept, this entire file goes to court. He'll have 48 hours to respond." "Good," I said. Mark looked at me, a hint of curiosity in his eyes. "You don't want to be there when he gets it?" I shook my head. "It's not necessary. His reaction is irrelevant. The result is what matters." I hadn't told Mark the whole truth. That piece of paper wasn't a legal weapon. It was a psychological one. The law could take David's money, but only the truth could take everything else. And I would be the one to pull that trigger. Just not yet. Exactly 48 hours later, David's lawyer called Mark. I wasn't there. I was at my temporary apartment, packing the last of my boxes, preparing for the move. Mark called me as soon as he hung up. "He's panicking," Mark said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. His lawyer tried to haggle, said his client made a mistake and wanted a more equitable deal. "And what did you say?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I said, "Equitable? Then we'll see you in court." He was silent for a few seconds, then said he'd call back. The next call came just an hour later. This time, there was no haggling. They surrendered. The settlement meeting was held at a neutral mediator's office, a sterile place with beige walls and bland furniture. David was there, looking thinner and paler than the last time I'd seen him. He couldn't meet my eyes. Chloe wasn't there. Of course not. She only showed up for the benefits, not the consequences. His lawyer, an older man with a weary face, tried to keep things professional. My lawyer, Mark, was as sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "My client agrees to the terms of the asset division," David's lawyer said, pushing a stack of papers across the table. 70% of our total marital assets were mine. The house, the majority of the investments, the savings. That was the price for my silence, the price to keep the scandal from going public and destroying his successful entrepreneur reputation. He was losing money, a lot of it. I could see it in the way he clenched his fists under the table, but I could also see a flicker of smugness in his eyes when he glanced at me. He thought he'd lost the battle but would win the war. He lost money, but he had a new family, a child on the way. He thought he still had what mattered most. He had miscalculated. We signed the papers one by one. Each signature was a tie being severed. The room was quiet except for the scratching of pen on paper. When the last signature was down, David's lawyer let out a quiet sigh of relief, as if he'd just finished a difficult surgery. "Well, that's that," he said. "Everything is settled." I stood up. Mark stood up. David remained seated, finally daring to look up at me. "Anya," he began, his voice shaky but trying for a noble tone, "I hope you can find—" "Don't!" I cut him off, my voice ice cold. "I don't need your hope. I need you to stay for 5 more minutes." Mark looked at me, slightly surprised. David's lawyer frowned. "Everything is signed," he said. "There's nothing left to discuss." "Oh, but there is," I replied, the first cold smile touching my lips. "The most important part is just beginning." I signaled to Mark. He raised an eyebrow slightly but trusted me, pulling a manila envelope from his briefcase. He had held it for me as requested, without knowing its contents. I took it from him. The envelope was thin, but it felt heavy in my hand. I walked back to the table and placed the envelope directly in front of David. "What is this?" his lawyer asked, his voice wary. "If this is a new demand, the agreement we just signed is void." "This isn't a demand," I said, my eyes locked on David. "It's a gift. A little bit of truth for you to start your new life with." David stared at the envelope, then up at me, confusion and suspicion warring on his face. He hesitated, then slowly opened it. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of the medical report from the San Antonio clinic, dated 3 years ago. I watched him. I saw his eyes scan the text, the medical jargon he probably didn't understand. Then he reached the bottom, the single line I had highlighted in red. "Azoospermia. Diagnosis. Sterile." The silence in the room became absolute. I could see the color drain from David's face, leaving it a sickly, chalky white. His hand began to tremble. What is this?" he stammered, his voice cracking. "This is a fake. It's a copy," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. "The original is in a safe place. It's the truth, David. The truth I hid to protect you. The truth you used to betray me." His lawyer leaned over, trying to read the paper over David's shoulder. His expression shifted from confusion to shock. David just shook his head, a mindless, repetitive motion, as if trying to physically deny what he was seeing. "No, it can't be. Chloe." "Ah, Chloe," I said, and it was time for the final blow. "Did you ever wonder why she was in such a hurry? Why she chose the exact time I was away on deployment?" I didn't need to say more. I had planted the seed of doubt, and in David's mind, the pieces were now frantically rearranging themselves. "She was pregnant by her ex-boyfriend," I said bluntly, giving him no time to process. "But he abandoned her right after. She needed a provider, a name for the baby, and you, David, you were the perfect choice." "No," he whispered. It wasn't a denial. It was the sound of a man breaking. The entire world he had just built, the coming child, the new love, the reason he had given up everything, shattered into a million pieces in a few short seconds. He had lost 70% of his assets, not to start a new life, but to pay for being the fool in an elaborate scam. He looked at me, and this time, there was no smugness or guilt in his eyes. There was only a hollow, terrifying emptiness. He understood everything. He hadn't just lost his money. He had lost it all. I gave him one last look, then turned away. "Let's go, Mark," I said. As we walked out the door, I could hear the sound of something being thrown violently against the wall, followed by a raw, soulless roar of anguish and despair. Mission complete. I never spoke to David again, nor did I speak to my parents or Chloe. A few days after that final meeting, I loaded the last box into a moving truck. As I drove out of Austin, heading toward the mountains of Colorado, I didn't look back. The past was a foreign country, and I had no reason to return. My new life was built on quiet. New base, new job, new comrades. Here, I was just Captain Petrova. No one knew about David, or Chloe, or my family. My identity was my own, built by me, not imposed on me. Occasionally, news from that old world would trickle in. Through a mutual old acquaintance, I learned what happened after that day. David had lost his mind. He confronted Chloe, and of course she couldn't deny it. Their argument, I was told, could be heard down the hall. David cut her off immediately. He canceled the lease, repossessed the car, and froze all her accounts. He vanished from her life as quickly as he had entered it. Word is, he sold his company for far less than it was worth, just so he could leave Texas as fast as possible. He was running, not from me, but from the truth about himself. Chloe, with no David and no money, had to move back in with our parents. The baby grew, but her future was empty. Her ex-boyfriend, the baby's real father, had disappeared without a trace. And my parents, they finally got what they wanted. Chloe at home, under their roof, but they had to live with the consequences. They lost their wealthy son-in-law, they lost the respect of their friends when the story inevitably leaked, and they lost me for good. Their house, the scene of that treacherous dinner, was now filled with the silence of recriminations and regret. They had traded a daughter for a gamble, and they had lost everything. I didn't feel a sense of triumph when I heard these things. I felt nothing. It wasn't my war anymore. This afternoon, I stood on the balcony of my apartment in Colorado, looking out at the Rocky Mountains. The air here is clean and cold. It clears my head. My transfer has been made permanent. My career is advancing. I survived the war. But unlike on the battlefield, victory here didn't come with a medal or a commendation. It just brought peace. A quiet, steady peace of my own making. And for me, that is more than enough.